And let's start out with what is the year in review? It is a report that we produce every year, going on 4 years now, and it's from annual in-depth analysis that we do of ICS threats, vulnerabilities, and insights from our frontline team, which we're going to talk about today. Insights from incident response engagements and pen tests and tabletop exercises. And the objective of the year in review is to really share these insights with the community so that we're better able to strengthen cyber defense capabilities. This is our second webinar of a 3-part series that we're sharing the highlights from the year in review. And our final webinar of the series will be on April 15th, where we focus in on vulnerabilities. Let's meet our panel. Our moderator, we're pleased to have Dr. Jacob Benjamin, who is our Director of Professional Services. And prior to Dragos, he was a nuclear cybersecurity researcher at the Idaho National Laboratory. He has substantial cybersecurity experience with operational technology at both domestic and international critical infrastructures. Jacob, over to you.
Thanks, Linda. Yes, so as Linda said, we're going to highlight the 5 lessons or recommendations that come out of our 2020 service engagements, which were all focused on industrial environments. So we're going to spend a few minutes on each one, and the panelists are going to add their unique perspectives to these lessons as we go on. So I'm going to introduce them now. We've got a variety of titles. So Dan, if you want to introduce yourself, and then Greg, and then David.
Hey everyone, my name is Daniel Michaud-Soucy. I'm one of the principal industrial pen testers on the proactive side of the professional services team.
And then I am David Collins, and I'm a senior industrial incident responder at Dragos.
Awesome. I'm Greg Pullman. I'm an industrial cybersecurity consultant here at Dragos, and typically I deal with tabletop exercises and incident response.
Thanks. So as you can see, we've got a wide variety of roles here. So Dan usually represents our red team kind of activities as well as advisory services. We have David, who does the incident response cases, and Greg, which is doing our advisory services, tabletop exercises, readiness, and those kinds of things. So we've got a wide variety of perspectives and expertise on these lessons. So the first one that we're going to look at is increasing our OT network visibility. It's overwhelmingly our #1 recommendation on the various engagements that we do. And I'll just take a minute to say that visibility, in this case is referring to network monitoring and log aggregation, whether that's host logs or network logs. And this is really important due to detection and response of ICS cyber attacks is impossible if you can't see what's actually happening on those networks. And so having the logs and the monitoring gives you the ability to then cull through the data and understand what's happening before the incident can impact a critical process or pose a risk to health and safety. It's particularly needed to validate prevention measures that while they work, they degrade over time, and it's a matter of time of when they fail, not if they fail. And then when that happens, we want to be able to detect, respond, and recover, and for that we need visibility. So David here has some anecdotes of trying to respond in the field to an incident and visibility. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that we chose visibility as #1 for our lessons learned, because honestly, visibility is king, kind of to echo what you were saying, Jacob. In the field, what we see when we walk into, and last year, none of our actual official IR engagements were helped or augmented by consolidated logging of any sort. And the problem you run into is when you kind of log something, you log this part of the network, or you have maybe net flow of this part of the network, or you have some of the hosts but not of all the host logs, or you don't have good indexing. The problem is every little bit that you don't have or is not well polished, ready for an analyst, you're just going to keep chipping away at your incident response time, and it's not just incident response time, also incidents in the first place. You can't prove negatives if you don't have confidence in what you can see, right? So if you're looking for something that just became huge news, kind of like what happened with the Citrix NetScaler thing, or even last year towards the end of the year, a major hack. You remember that? People, we had organizations going looking to see if they had any of the devices, seeing if they were exploitable, or had the presence of the IOCs that were being found, but they didn't have any visibility. They don't have any logging. They don't have any host logging. They don't have any way to query any type of data set. And that's the biggest part, is you want to be able to get answers from your network information and your host information. And it makes everything smoother, especially incident response.
Awesome, thanks. Now, I'll say that we do have dedicated webinars that were earlier in the year that were focused on gaining visibility and how to do that. Those were hosted by Mike Hoffman and Josh Carlson. I encourage everyone to go look at those if you're looking to, build OT network visibility. But perhaps, Daniel, do you have anything, or David or Greg, on quickly just about how you would go about building up visibility?
Yeah, I think that identifying what the assets that you care about, which we'll touch upon, very, very shortly, in terms of what your crown jewels are, which we'll call them, in the next couple of bits, and then understanding the traffic flows that come to and from those devices can help you get started on, okay, well, I'm not going to capture everything because I don't have the capability of analyzing everything. Therefore, I'm going to focus on the things that are critical to my operation. So I think that that's a good starting point, naturally.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Anyone else? Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to add, having a collection management framework kind of identified around those critical assets, those crown jewels that have been identified within the network is pretty key in being able to quickly react when a situation is unfolding. You already know where to find that information, where to gain the information that feeds kind of the situational awareness monster during an incident, in a cybersecurity incident. And again, it just, back to David's point, it makes everything smoother when those things are pre-identified and built around, specific crown jewels and dependencies within the network.
Right. And I love how this ties directly into visibility, because essentially what's happening is it's a logical layout of what you want to watch. So when you're going to, as an organization, improve your visibility or improve your cybersecurity, it's something you can just open up, look at it, and say, oh, we don't have visibility here or here or here. All right, let's throw some money at that and we'll get that done. And it makes even that administration very easy. And that's something we definitely hit hard a lot with a lot of our engagements.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say, David, is how helpful would a CMF, like, a single index of devices and their logging capacity and what kind of data they store, how helpful would that be to you on an IR case? Like, I would imagine it would save hours of time. You show up somewhere, you don't have to identify where all these data sources are. Maybe you can elaborate that on a minute, and then we'll pivot to crown jewels.
Leveraging IR. Jacob?
Yeah, I was just saying, leveraging the CMF on IR, like having that, how much time would that save you?
Well, yeah, absolutely. It would, right? It's a great dream to have, that we have a major incident happen, and guess what? It's a customer that has already gone through the entire CMF creation process, and we get to arrive and say, oh, wow, you know all of your data sources, you know where they live, you know how to get to them, you know how long it takes. It makes prioritization of response efforts very smooth, and it's an amazing. It would be an amazing thing. I've yet to see it, but and there's more mature customers. I'm not saying there's no one who watches anything. No, it's just it's never to that optimal point, but the more you have, the better off you are.
Thanks. Awesome. And we've already touched on crown jewels and what that means a little bit about how you would want visibility to them and CMFs around them. But perhaps we can step back a minute and just talk about what is crown jewels briefly and why they matter. Greg.
Yeah. So the concept of crown jewels is to identify within the logical layer of the network, what an adversary would have to leverage in order to generate a physical effect. That process and how to use the information that derived from that process really helps to account for the consequences of an attack on an ICS environment, and allows for the focused mitigation strategy to be considered associated with that attack pathway. We've grown to the position that this is an optimal approach when organizations are trying to maximize the return on the investment of not only cybersecurity solutions, but also the planning rigor that is surrounding, from an incident response standpoint.
So you talk about crown jewels and how it's based on consequences and prioritizing that from a risk standpoint with the, inputs that are typical to industrial environments. Maybe you're looking at final safety analysis reports, you're looking at hazard analysis and things like that. Is there some generic asset types that typically commonly come up as crown jewels? Like, what are we commonly seeing as crown jewels, Greg?
Sure. So, in a Purdue model layer structure, obviously attackers typically will leverage a vendor connection within the operational layer or the process layer down at that front, or even the plant control layer or the process layer. But really, it is identifying the critical systems that are dependent upon for functional output. And as you're walking through those functional dependencies, then identifying the actual no-kidding critical functions of a process flow or a process control, down to the critical components, which are both physical assets required to complete that critical function, and also the control elements exercising control over that process. From there, pitching back up into the control network and no kidding, framing those control elements and saying, okay, for an adversary to generate an effect on this function, on this process, the historian, the controller, the operator workstation or engineer workstation, specifically, driving the configuration files for that process. All those things have to be leveraged to generate this type of an effect.
Thanks, Greg. So we're talking, HMIs, operator workstations, PLCs, things like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
Now, Daniel, you have an anecdote about red teaming against crown jewels. If you want to speak to that.
Yeah, certainly. As Greg said, ultimately, the customer would like to see what kind of impact we could have hypothetically, right, and then on their environment and their ability to fulfill their mission purpose, right, their industrial process, whatever it may be. And so, as the consequence-driven scoping methodology and crown jewel analysis methodology is derived, it's based on identifying where we would potentially have impact, or where an adversary would want to go to have impact, and go from there. And so it then becomes a matter of overlaying the idea of what the crown jewels are with what the various attack paths are, for someone to reach those crown jewels, right? Given our initial foothold, whether that's an assumed breach type scenario in the IT network, and identifying whatever pivot paths may exist between, that starting point and those crown jewels, and basically that becomes our target and our idea, right? Yeah, I think so.
So preventing logic changes and things like that on the crown jewels. That's perfect. I think we should jump to recommendation number 3 if we can. So boosting IR capabilities. So we do tabletop exercises in cyber readiness where we'll come up with custom scenarios and have clients execute their incident response plans and things like that. Greg has some great lessons learned out of that. Like how can they boost that? Where are there common issues that we can look as a community to fix in that area?
Of course. So one right off the bat, most organizations have not adopted a dedicated communications annex or framework within their incident response plan. When I'm doing tabletop exercises, I find that that is the first stumbling block out of the gate during an incident, right? Having a comprehensive communication plan consisting not only of the notification procedures, the incident command structure, those types of things ensure that a primary response management and employment mechanism is accessible during those first, those first major muscle movements of an incident. And the communication plan can act as a guide to quickly activate and assemble the team, employ those resources and capabilities, and also informs the right stakeholders of the situation at hand. So that's one. Two, kind of the analytic rigor that goes into planning all as a whole. To elevate your incident response plan to the ever-changing threat landscape means that you have to be able to consume threat intelligence and produce it back, produce the actions associated with that back into your incident response plan. And then three, building the thresholds of activation and assessment around those pieces of threat intelligence. So those are typically what I see right out of the gate is, a communications plan to activate and assemble, being able to tie threat intelligence back into the incident response plan, which leads to better thresholds and assessment tools built into the incident response plan to recognize that an incident is occurring.
Thanks, Craig. So you're saying there's all kinds of existing documentation plans that people are already doing at electric utilities, at power plants and things like that. They already have emergency plans, and so really and communication plans. And so really the key here is tying and linking them to ICS Cyber and making sure that there are references and links to identify cyber events there, and then executing their normal plan. And something that they already trained and ready on. So they're sort of 50% there, if you will. And so now it's making sure that they have those linkages from the cross-disciplinary teams. Yeah, so I think that's, we got some questions, so I want to say time set for that. So let's go ahead and go to recommendation number 4. So validating network segmentation. So network segmentation is clearly like it's a long time mitigation suggestion. For years, this was like the go-to strategy plan. It's supported by industry standards and things like that. It's like the first thing you have to do is isolate your network from the outside world. And that's great, but there's, as time goes on, this deteriorates, holes are put in the firewalls for various use cases and things like that. So how do we validate network segmentation? I know there's some things that we do on the red team side to help do that. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about like how you would go about validating network segmentation?
Sure. For what it's worth, you mentioned on the red team side, but even on the more consulting or advisory side, you can do passively, just a firewall review, right? Understanding what the perimeter device is between the IT network and the OT network, which should be the main, network segmentation, function device, and pulling those firewall rules out and that configuration out. And assessing that is a good way to at least assess that what is assumed to be the perimeter device, right? Now, you have to understand that there may also be other pathways that circumvent that device, and that's where it becomes problematic, and that's where it may be interesting to employ a more active, segmentation validation strategy, such as a penetration test, to say, okay, if the goal of an adversary is to get into my OT network, they may not just take the assumed path, right? They may not just take the regular IT to OT path. They may look for other paths, and that's where it starts to become interesting to see, like, okay, well, as a matter of fact, yes, my IT to OT network firewall is properly configured, and the conduits between the two are very well defined and understood, but this development network was stood up, and there's a network segment that we're working with a third party on that is exposed to remote access capabilities, right? And so passively, yeah, sure, take a look at what you have, understand the architecture, firewall reviews, those types of things, and then more actively, certainly, an exercise like a penetration test could be helpful.
Yeah, I would just say that. So there's a lot of times with network segmentation, if there's any, it kind of ties back to visibility in the beginning. You have to have visibility to understand, to constantly validate that your network is continuing to be segmented. You know, it was segmented on the day that you did it, but what about after that? What about 90 days, a year after that? Those kinds of things. There's an example I have from one of our architecture reviews. uh, you know, the client, this was at a natural gas facility. The client, you know, had implemented a Purdue model, you know, we're several levels down before they get to the safety zone. And the team was able to identify an external connection that would drop in right below, right at L1. And so it skips over the DMZs and the firewalls and all those multiple levels and drops right into L1. And the only thing standing between an adversary at that point and the safety zone was a VLAN. Now, now VLAN hopping is a thing, and Dan, you can talk about maybe how hard that is or something. But in general, you know, it's a little scary when a situation like that where you've set up multiple layers of defenses and then to just have an external connection bypass all of those. Yeah, but let's go ahead and go to the fifth recommendation. I want to save some stuff for time. So this goes a little bit to that as well. So separate IT and OT credential management. Like, Dan, do you want to talk about what this means? And I've got a question for David on this specifically as well.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, I mean, credential management, the old passwords, right? We have to end up using them at some point, whether it's an application password or a system password or a device password, right? And then, you know, a lot of the common problems that we'll find on engagements are default passwords and shared passwords and passwords that have never changed and passwords that are stored in all sorts of places, right? And we all understand that they're important, but managing them properly is inconvenient and difficult, right? So then folks take shortcuts like having a single operator account for the entire plant and a single engineer account for the entire plant and a single manager account for the entire plant. And a lot of times those accounts are over privileged as well. And then you store those credentials in an email because I mean, where else am I going to put them? I'm not going to do the post-it thing because consultants tell me all the time that don't put the passwords on the post-its, right? So it becomes quite complex, and so it's important to consider things like using unique passwords and secure password policies that will prioritize length over complexity. Consider multi-factor authentication for remote access, things like that. And then to your point specifically, Jacob, in some mature cases where those basics are somewhat handled, then we'll start to see Active Directory infrastructure in place in the operations environment, and oftentimes, just because it's convenient, it's easy to deploy, it'll be shared between the IT space and the OT space. And so there are some benefits to that, certainly from just an operationalization perspective, but the drawback is obvious. From an adversary's perspective, it makes pivoting between the IT network and the OT network relatively trivial. And where we've been discussing network segmentation, there's a bigger segmentation thought around, not only network, but domain segmentation and then application segmentation as well. And so being aware of that and considering that in the way that you design, the way that you manage credentials, IT credentials versus OT credentials, things like that, is really important. So in the context, right, like running a tool like Bloodhound can be super helpful to see what kind of paths exist between the various systems and domains, to understand kind of what a typical attack path would be, or what the attack path that an adversary would take would be, to move between those two networks.
Thanks, Dan. So one thing I immediately stands out to me is just the capability of you, like you said, pivoting from IT to OT, but also just lateral movement and the use of these sort of valid accounts, if you will, to sort of hide in network traffic. David, I believe you had an IR case that was centered around like lateral movement. Will you speak to that briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, that's awesome. And Daniel, I couldn't agree more with what you were saying about expanding, not just thinking about human passwords, but also processes. Everything, there's so many things that are integrated and automatically happening. People set up these automation processes on their network to allow, other things to work smoother. And we've seen that shoot people in the foot all the time. Like, obviously, this customer probably couldn't have seen this happen. It's a 0-day exploit. But if they understood how the software itself worked, it was a Citrix. I think I brought it up earlier. The Citrix NetScaler exploit that was, I think it was announced, the notification went out end of 2019, but we really didn't see anything until until the very end of the year. A POC dropped on GitHub, and we saw an activity group. We didn't learn this till months later, but the activity group used a POC and fired it all over, and they were able to get access to a government entity and cause quite a stir. But the problem was this government entity, it was not an optimal network segmentation or credential management or visibility or any of our recommendations that we've gone over. It was pretty much the worst case scenario as far as the structure itself. But it's scary because someone gets in and there was a domain that had full trust with another domain. They had recently taken all their different segments and just smushed them together onto one flat network. And they didn't even know what was on their network. It was so large, and everything was routable. It was just completely routable. It took months. The FBI was involved. The National Guard was involved. It was a nasty cleanup, and it was an activity group. It was actually Dragos named activity group Parasite, which does the initial infection, and then they actually handed it over and had plenty of time to hand it over to Magnalium, who does follow-up actions and things that are more persistent and long-term. So it was pretty scary.
Awesome. I've got some good questions here. So concerning network visibility, do you think ICS network probes are a must-have or a nice-to-have? I know what I think, but what does someone on the panel think?
So I saw that question come in, and I was like, huh, that's cool. That's a good cue for me or any of us. Yeah, no, that's it's absolutely it's an awesome thing to be aware of, right? It's an absolute must-have. You can't not have this in security, in the security world. When you're talking in relation to having a secure network, if you don't have protocol analyzers that are doing some type of contextual monitoring, something, then you're completely losing out. You score 0 on the 0 to 10, like, or any scale, in my opinion.
Thanks, David. So there is a question here about the best way to collect evidence post-incident. Traditional digital forensic methodology doesn't translate well to ICS and SCADA environments. They're asking for the best logs, libraries, artifacts to determine attribution specifically, which that might be a better question for the Intel team on the next webinar. They do a lot of that. I mean, the digital evidence collection is certainly David and our IR team, but attribution is something that we typically stray away from. But I know we've got some white papers and things out there on doing forensics, and of course, I don't know if there's a single blog that we can point to or anything on the tools. Do you know anything?
I don't know if there's a specific path we can point them to answer the question. However, when it comes to attribution, right, we do try to stay away from that. However, we do extensive work naming activity groups and putting activities and things that we're seeing that are trends into activity group buckets, or maybe creating a new activity group. And that's how we kind of handle attribution. And like Jacob said, the Intel can go on and on and on about this, how they roll in new forensic data.
Yeah. And so I've got a question here as well about is there any recommendations out there for customizable IR policy templates or incident scenarios or tabletop scenarios? I know there's GridX and things like that, but maybe Greg, you can speak a little bit to IR templates and things like that.
Well,
or Dan might have one as well. Go ahead.
I'll just go back to a point that I made earlier on the panel. I think when it comes to knowing your environment and yourself, you have to look within your organization to understand, like, to leverage the frameworks that are already existing there, right? And weave those into the standard language of incident response plan templates. Most organizations have an IT incident response, but maybe not an OT, or haven't blended the OT incident response in with that. But typically, the same consequences of a cyber attack on a critical environment can be looked at through the same lens as what your emergency response plan might look like, and the framework kind of associated with that. I don't know of any specific templates that that are customizable for specific OT environments, but scenarios that we build here at Dragos, we typically leverage scenarios that are already seen within the industrial space. So, for example, the Texas BP plant explosion, that happened in 2005, I think. I'm not saying that a cyber event would generate that type of physical effect, but walking back and looking at the causes of that specific event and figuring out what logical systems may be involved with that to create a plant trip or shutdown or even a health, safety, environmental event around that are kind of good places to look at scenario generations and seeing where you can combine your crown jewel analysis with a specific scenario.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. There's a question here about ransomware in ICS environments. Are we seeing more incidents of there? I know there was at least one earlier, but David, I don't know if you can speak to any of those or if you were on any of those.
Yeah, so to answer this question and to give as much visibility as possible for it, we're not seeing like an uptick or something in ransomware occurrences in OT, but the thing is they're possible, right? And as far as managing the consequences and managing the occurrences of that happening, you really have to start at a broad look at your cyber readiness. And that's really, it's a very general answer. And that's because the cyber, I mean, you can make a wormable malware out of any type of 0-day exploit. So network segmentation, visibility, kind of going down the list of our recommendations for this webinar, really.
Awesome, thanks. I got one more. Have we observed any ICS SCADA cloud cases lately? And if yes, were there any consequences on cybersecurity? I haven't seen any specific come across. I've seen where we have done some assessments on cloud infrastructures being implemented, but I haven't seen any IR cases. Is that true on your end, David?
Yeah, no IR cases, but as far as use cases, I mean, we do see customers starting to engage in cloud-based security and sending data off to the cloud so that it can be analyzed and things. But no, I don't know of and haven't heard of any incidents where that has shot said customer in the foot.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for the great questions and for the time here. Linda, do you want to let them know about the next webinar?
Certainly. Thank you for the team. This was a great insight. Appreciate you all sharing it with us. And thank you all for attending. Hope to see you on April 15th when we explore vulnerabilities. Our team analyzed over 700 vulnerabilities as part of the year in review, and they're going to be sharing some interesting findings. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.